The Blackwood Slasher, Lost Girl. Chapter 1. The moon loomed low in the night sky, an unblinking eye casting its cold, silvery glow over the endless sprawl of Blackwood Forest. The pines rose like ancient sentinels, their gnarled branches twisting into clawed silhouettes that scraped at the heavens. The air was unnaturally still, broken only by the occasional groan of the trees, as if the forest itself were alive, watching, waiting. 8-year-old Alice stumbled through the underbrush, her bare feet leaving faint trails in the damp soil. Her small hands clawed at the ferns and brambles that reached out like grasping fingers, tearing at her pale skin. The once neat braid her mother had carefully woven that morning had unravelled, her blonde hair now a tangled mess clinging to her tear-streaked face. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, and every exhale misted in the icy air. The darkness pressed in around her, oppressive and absolute, swallowing all but the faintest shafts of moonlight that pierced the canopy above. Each shadow seemed to shift, alive with unseen menace. A low guttural sound, a growl or perhaps the wind, rose from somewhere deeper in the forest, sending a shiver coursing through her small frame. "Mommy," she whimpered, the word trembling on her lips, barely audible above the pounding of her own heartbeat. She paused for a moment, her wide blue eyes scanning the trees, searching for any sign of safety. But the forest offered no comfort. It felt endless, a labyrinth of darkness and despair. Somewhere behind her a branch snapped, sharp and deliberate. Alice froze, her body trembling as terror surged through her veins. She spun around, straining to see through the shadows. The sound came again, closer this time. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching through the undergrowth. They were coming for her. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, each one escaping as a visible puff of mist in the frigid night air. The forest was alive, the crack of twigs underfoot, the distant hoot of an owl, and the eerie whisper of the wind weaving through the canopy. But beneath it all, Alice heard them, the muffled curses and heavy footsteps of the men searching for her. "Keep going," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "Don't stop." The memory of her escape flickered in her mind. One of the kidnappers, a chubby man with shifty eyes the others called Billy, had reluctantly let her out of the van to use the bathroom. They'd stopped on a desolate road skirting the forest, its edges swallowed by shadows. Jake and Ronnie, the other two, were too engrossed in an argument to notice her. Sensing her chance, Alice had fled across the water and bolted into the trees before Billy could react. Now reality pressed in like the dark closing around her. She was alone in an unfamiliar forest, in the dead of night, with dangerous men on her heels. Fear clawed at her resolve, but she forced it down. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "You're my little lioness, brave and fierce." She clung to the words, letting them steady her shaking legs as she pushed forward. Just then, a sharp snap broke through the night, and Alice froze. She pressed herself against the rough bark of a towering pine, holding her breath. The forest seemed to grow still with her. Time stretched, marked only by the faint trickle of a creek and the restless rustling of leaves above. She dared a glance around the tree. Shadows cloaked everything, yet the darkness felt alive, watching. The sensation crawled up her spine like an icy finger tracing each vertebra. The kidnappers weren't the only ones hunting her. She could feel it. Something unseen lurked among the trees, its gaze heavier than the night. A shiver racked her thin frame, and she pulled her sweater tighter, as if it could shield her from more than the cold. "She couldn't have gone far," a voice barked in the distance. Jake. His tone was sharp, commanding, laced with frustration. Alice flinched. Jake. He was the reason she was here, the mastermind behind her abduction. She had known something was wrong with him the moment he stepped into her family's life as their new groundskeeper. His crooked smile and calculating eyes screamed danger. Even as a child she'd felt it, the instinctual urge to run. Now she wished she'd listened. Summoning her courage, Alice pushed away from the tree and continued deeper into the forest. The terrain grew more uneven, the ground sloping downward and littered with rocks and fallen branches. She stumbled several times, scraping her knees and palms, but the stinging pain only spurred her onward. Alice's pulse quickened. They were getting closer. She scanned her surroundings desperately, her eyes struggling to penetrate the shadows. Ahead, she noticed a faint outline filtering through the trees. Could it be a house? Hope flickered within her. If she could find someone, anyone, to help her, she might just escape this nightmare. She moved onward, each step careful but swift. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter, suggesting she had gained some distance. Through the dense foliage, she glimpsed a small clearing bathed in the pale glow of the moon. Curiosity tempered by caution, she edged closer. As she parted the low-hanging branches, an old, dilapidated cabin came into view. Its wooden walls were weathered and warped, and the roof sagged under the weight of creeping vines. Broken windows stared back at her like hollow eyes. Alice hesitated. The cabin looked abandoned, but something about it felt unwelcoming. She considered turning away, continuing her aimless trek through the forest, but her body protested. Her legs ached, and her eyelids were heavy. The thought of shelter, even in such a forlorn place, was too tempting to ignore. Gathering her courage, she stepped into the clearing. The grass was overgrown, brushing against her shins as she walked toward the cabin. The front steps creaked ominously under her weight, and the porch boards felt unstable, but they held. She reached the front door, which hung slightly ajar, its paint peeling to reveal the bare wood beneath. She pushed the door gently, and it swung open with a drawn-out groan. The interior was cloaked in darkness, but as her eyes adjusted, she could make out the shapes of furniture draped in shadows. Cautiously, she crossed the threshold. Inside, the air was cool and tinged with the scent of damp wood and dust. Moonlight filtered through cracks in the walls and ceiling, casting thin beams that illuminated particles floating lazily in the air. To her right stood a rickety table, one leg shorter than the others, causing it to tilt precariously. A single chair lay toppled beside it. Against the far wall was a stone fireplace, its hearth cold and empty. Above it rested a framed photograph, just out of her reach. Alice felt a strange pull toward the image. She moved closer, standing on her tiptoes in an attempt to see it better, but the details remained elusive in the dim moonlight. She noticed that the mantel was adorned with small trinkets, a tarnished key, a chipped mug, and a faded ribbon. These remnants of past inhabitants made the cabin feel less like a forgotten relic, and more like a place that once held life and laughter. A yawn escaped her lips, and she realized just how weary she was. The adrenaline that had fueled her escape was waning, leaving her drained. The hard wooden floor didn't look inviting, but it was better than nothing. She spotted an old rug near the fireplace, frayed at the edges but still intact. Pulling it toward her, she laid it out and sat down, drawing her knees to her chest. "Mom, Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. Her thoughts drifted to her parents. She wondered if they were looking for her, if they were worried. A lump formed in her throat, but she swallowed it down. "Stay strong," she whispered to herself. "Just until morning." The quiet of the cabin was a stark contrast to the ominous ambience of the forest. Here, at least, she felt somewhat protected from the unknown threats that lurked outside. She listened intently, but heard nothing beyond the gentle sigh of the wind. Her gaze returned to the photograph above the mantel. The faces were still obscured by shadows, but she imagined the family it depicted: a mother, a father, perhaps a child. Did they once sit by this very fireplace, sharing stories and warmth? The thought brought a small measure of comfort. As she settled in, her eyelids grew heavier. The events of the day replayed in her mind: the sudden abduction, the fear, the escape. It all felt surreal, like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. But sleep was overtaking her, and despite her attempts to stay alert, her body surrendered. Curling up on the tattered rug, she closed her eyes. The sounds of the cabin, creaking timbers, the distant hoot of an owl, lulled her into a deep slumber. She was unaware of the dangers that surrounded her, both known and unseen. Outside, the forest remained vigilant. The trees whispered among themselves, leaves rustling with secrets. A figure moved silently through the underbrush, pausing at the edge of the clearing. The moon cast a pale light upon a white mask that concealed the watcher's face. The Blackwood Slasher stood motionless, observing the cabin where the young girl slept. But tonight, the forest's guardian did not approach. Instead, he lingered in the shadows, his gaze fixed upon the small trespasser within his home. The night was deep, and while Alice found sanctuary in the shadows, the darkness around her was alive with intentions yet unknown. Chapter 2. The dense canopy of Blackwood Forest loomed like a shroud, swallowing the faint starlight and suffocating the world below in an oppressive darkness. The air was thick, damp, and heavy with the scent of moss and decay. Jake marched ahead, his flashlight slicing furiously through the shadows, his boots crushing the undergrowth with a force that matched his seething anger. His clenched jaw twitched beneath the stubble of his unshaven face, every step radiating frustration. Behind him, Ronnie trailed at a relaxed pace, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his threadbare jacket. He puffed lazily on a cigarette, the ember glowing like a sinister beacon in the gloom. Billy lagged several paces behind, his eyes darting nervously to every shifting shadow, every creak of the forest. "How could you let her slip away?" Jake snapped, spinning around so fast his flashlight beam caught Billy square in the face. "One job, one simple fucking job. Watch the girl while she takes a piss, and you couldn't even manage that?" Billy swallowed hard, his throat dry. The flashlight glare made him squint, but he didn't dare look away. I thought she was just behind the tree," he stammered. "She was there 1 minute, and then—" "And then you proved you're about as useful as a screen door on a submarine," Jake snarled, his voice dripping with venom. He took a step closer, looking at Billy's pale, sweat-drenched face. "Do you have any idea what's at stake here?" "That kid is worth $20 million, Jake growled, his words cutting through the stillness. "Her family will pay anything to get their little princess back. And I didn't spend months playing the part of the dutiful kiss-ass groundskeeper just to let it all fall apart because of your fat ass." Ronnie chuckled, leaning casually against a tree and enjoying Billy's squirm. The faint glow of his cigarette lit up his grin, smug and mocking. "Let's face it, Jake. We all knew Billy wasn't cut out for this kind of work." Billy's face flushed a deep red, a mixture of fear and humiliation twisting his expression. "I can fix this," he pleaded, his voice trembling. "We'll find her. She couldn't have gone far." Jake's eyes narrowed, cold and calculating. "You better pray we do, because if we don't—" He let the words hang in the air like a noose. "You'll be the one lost in these woods." Billy lowered his gaze, his hands shaking at his sides. The promise of easy money had lured him in, a way out of his dead-end life, or so he'd thought. But now, with Jake's threat hanging over him and the forest pressing in like a living nightmare, he realized just how far out of his depth he was. Jake turned sharply, resuming his march, the flashlight beam swaying with his strides. Ronnie pushed off from the tree, falling into step beside Jake. "Gotta hand it to the kid, she's smart," slipped right under Billy's nose. He shot a mocking glance back at Billy. Maybe we should have hired her instead of this tub of lard. Billy bristled, but fear kept his tongue in check. He trudged along behind them, his boots catching on roots and undergrowth as the terrain grew rougher. As they pressed deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close ranks around them, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their branches forming a skeletal lattice against the faint moonlight. The air grew colder, and a suffocating silence descended, broken only by the occasional cry of some distant nocturnal creature. Every sound made Billy jump, a snapping twig, the rustle of leaves, even his own breath. Somewhere far off, a low, guttural growl rumbled through the woods. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but enough to send a shiver crawling up Billy's spine. He quickened his pace, moving closer to Jake and Ronnie. For the first time, he wasn't sure what scared him more, the men walking ahead of him or whatever might be lurking in the shadows. Why do we have to come in this forest? Billy muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. Everyone knows this place ain't right. Jake stopped so abruptly that Ronnie nearly collided with him. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Billy like a predator sizing up its prey. What did you just say? Billy hesitated, then blurted out, People talk about these woods. They say folks go missing here, that there's something out here. Ronnie barked out a laugh, the sound echoing hollowly in the vast darkness. Don't tell me you're scared of bedtime stories, Billy. Jake's expression darkened, his gaze cutting like a knife. I don't have time for your superstitions. The only thing you need to worry about is finding that girl. Unless... He took a deliberate step closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. You'd rather stay here alone, see if those ghost stories come true. Billy shook his head furiously. No, Then shut up and keep moving, Jake barked, spinning on his heel. Remember when we first came up with this plan? Ronnie said as they continued searching. You posing as the gardener, me handling the getaway, and Billy... Well, I suppose we never did figure out what his role was. Jake allowed a slight smirk at his brother's words. He was supposed to be the babysitter. Guess we see how that turned out. Billy's frustration boiled over. I've done everything you've asked. I'm the one who hot-wired the van, who kept watch when you grabbed the girl. And yet here we are, Jake retorted, chasing after a child because you couldn't keep an eye on her for 2 minutes. The path grew steeper and the underbrush thicker. Thorns snagged at their clothes, and roots seemed to reach out to trip them. Billy could feel the weight of the forest pressing down, an oppressive force that made it hard to breathe. Maybe we should head back, Billy suggested tentatively, his voice barely more than a whisper. Regroup at the van, come up with a new plan. Jake stopped abruptly, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the dense shadows. He turned slowly, his patience visibly eroding. Head back? And tell me, Billy, what then? We cut our losses, crawl back to our miserable lives and forget the 20 million on the line. Is that your big idea? Ronnie stepped closer, the faint ember of his cigarette glowing like a malevolent eye. You scared of the dark, Billy? Or is it those stories crawling under your skin? Billy met Ronnie's mocking gaze, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. Summoning a shred of courage, he asked, You ever hear about the Blackwood Slasher? Ronnie snorted, his laugh a sharp, humourless sound. Oh, here we go. Campfire tales now, is it? Jake let out a long, exasperated sigh. Save the ghost stories for someone who gives a damn, Billy. I'm serious, Billy insisted, his voice gaining a desperate edge. They say he was a man who lost his family in a fire. It drove him mad. He went feral and started living in these woods, hunting anyone unlucky enough to cross his path. They call him the Blackwood Slasher. Ronnie's smirk widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. You mean they call him bullshit? Next, you'll tell me he's got glowing red eyes and carries an axe. I'm not making it up, Billy snapped, his voice rising. What about all those people who disappeared? Hunters, hikers, whole families. They were never found. Jake's fist clenched around the flashlight. Enough! His shout cut through the forest like a gunshot. I don't care if this place is haunted, cursed, or crawling with monsters. The only thing you need to worry about is me. And trust me, Billy, if we don't find that girl, you'll be the one wishing you'd disappeared. Billy shrank back, his face pale in the flashlight's glare. But before he could respond, a sudden rustling erupted from the bushes nearby. All 3 men froze. Jake's hand shot to his pistol, yanking it free with a swift, practiced motion. Ronnie's cigarette slipped from his lips, smouldering as it hit the ground. Billy stood rooted to the spot, his face ashen, eyes wide with fear. The rustling grew louder, more deliberate. Whatever it wasn't small. They exchanged uneasy glances, their breathing shallow, each straining to hear beyond the thunder of their own hearts. Probably just a raccoon, Ronnie muttered, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Yeah, a raccoon, Jake replied, though his grip on the pistol tightened, the barrel trained unwaveringly on the bushes. Billy said nothing, his body trembling as he fought the urge to run. For a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, without warning, the bushes fell still, the rustling silenced as quickly as it had begun. The quiet that followed was deafening, heavier than before, as if the forest itself were listening. Jake turned back to Billy, his jaw tight, his eyes hard. "Listen to me and listen close," he growled, his voice barely above a whisper. "There is no such thing as the Blackwood Slasher. The only real danger in these woods is me, and you wasting my time is a good way to find out just how dangerous I can be." Billy opened his mouth to protest but thought better of it, nodding instead. The unease coiled in his stomach refused to leave. Jake gave the bush one last glare before holstering his pistol. "Keep moving!" he barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. They pressed on, the forest swallowing them deeper with every step. The air seemed thicker, colder, as if the woods themselves were closing in. The faint path beneath their feet began to vanish, replaced by uneven ground and gnarled roots that snagged their boots. The noises of the forest grew louder, more intrusive. Branches cracking, leaves rustling, distant cries of animals that sounded far too human. Billy trudged along at the rear, his gaze darting to every shadow. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that whatever had been in the bushes wasn't just some harmless animal. Something was out there, watching, waiting. And it wasn't Jake he feared anymore. Chapter 3. The cabin stood in solemn silence, its weathered timbers groaning softly under the weight of the encroaching night. Moonlight spilled through shattered windows, painting the interior in fractured beams of light and shadow. The air was icy, slipping through the cracked walls to settle like a veil over the room. Yet Alice slept undisturbed on the frayed rug by the hearth, her small form rising and falling with the rhythm of her steady breaths. Exhaustion had claimed her entirely, pulling her into a deep and dreamless slumber. At the threshold, a figure emerged, a phantom against the darkness outside. The Blackwood Slasher moved with an unnatural quiet, his towering frame eclipsing the doorway. Over 6 feet tall, he seemed more shadow than man, his broad shoulders wrapped in a tattered coat that whispered faintly with his every movement. His face was obscured by the pale mask that had become legend in the surrounding towns, smooth, featureless, and haunting in its stark simplicity. From the shadows of the mask's narrow slits, his gaze settled on the child. In his gloved hand, the worn handle of an old axe hung with an ease that belied its deadly weight. The blade, dulled but formidable, caught the faint glint of moonlight. Yet in that moment, he made no move to wield it. His stance held no menace. Instead, he stood still, as though rooted to the floorboards, a storm of conflicted emotions churning beneath the cold mask. The glow of the moon traced Alice's face, illuminating the delicate features softened in sleep. Loose strands of her tangled blonde hair fell across her cheek, stirring faintly with every exhale. A flicker of something long buried stirred within the slasher, a distant echo of a life he had forsaken. Memories surged unbidden, the sound of laughter, the weight of small hands tugging at his own, and a child's voice, pure and trusting, calling him Daddy. His grip on the axe tightened briefly before he set it down, resting it against the doorframe. He stepped forward, his movements deliberate, the floorboards beneath him refusing to betray his presence. Alice shivered in her sleep, her body curling tighter against the chill that seeped through the cabin. The slasher's gaze shifted to the fireplace, its blackened hearth long abandoned. A small pile of logs lay scattered nearby. He knelt, arranging them with a precision that seemed almost reverent. For a moment, he hesitated, his gloved hand hovering over the dry wood. Then, as if summoned by his will alone, a flicker of flame danced to life. It grew, steady and sure, until a modest fire crackled, its warmth slowly spreading through the room. The golden light softened the cabin's decay, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Alice stirred, inching closer to the warmth in her sleep, her small body visibly relaxing as the chill retreated. The slasher lingered for a moment, his imposing frame illuminated by the firelight. The mask's blank surface reflected the flames, a haunting contrast to the faint, unspoken humanity etched in his posture. A sound from outside, a faint yelling of anger. His head tilted, listening intently. The men who pursued the girl were out there, their presence like a stain on his forest. His gloved hand reclaimed the axe, fingers curling around the familiar grip as he rose to his full height. As he turned toward the door, a floorboard creaked softly beneath his weight. Alice stirred, her eyelids fluttering but not fully opening. He froze, his form a shadow against the flickering firelight. She shifted slightly, her lips parting in a faint murmur, then drifted back into stillness. The slasher moved with the same preternatural grace as before, stepping through the doorway and into the forest's waiting embrace. The night swallowed him, shadows wrapping around his form like a cloak. At the edge of the clearing he stopped, turning back to watch the cabin. His gaze lingered for a moment. Inside, Alice's eyes opened briefly. The warmth of the fire soothed her, its glow a comforting presence. She smiled faintly, her lips forming words too soft to reach the trees beyond. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the crackle of the flames. The slasher, satisfied, turned away. The forest greeted him like an old ally, its shadows concealing him completely. He vanished into the night, his form melting into the dark until he was indistinguishable from the twisted shapes of the trees. At that moment, a dark Cadillac slowed to a stop beside the abandoned van once occupied by the kidnappers. The ominous vehicle remained motionless for several seconds, as though its driver were inspecting the scene. Then, just as silently, it pulled away, continuing down the empty road toward another unknown destination. Chapter 4. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, a maze of towering trees and tangled underbrush that confounded even the most seasoned traveller. Jake pushed forward, his frustration mounting with each step. The beam of his flashlight pierced the darkness, but its light felt feeble against the oppressive gloom of Blackwood Forest. "Where the hell are we? Feels like we're going around in circles," Ronnie muttered, swatting away a low-hanging branch that snagged his jacket. His usually confident demeanour was fading, replaced by a growing unease. Jake gritted his teeth. "We wouldn't be in this mess if someone hadn't let the girl escape," he snapped, casting a sharp glance back at Billy. Billy trudged behind them, limping slightly from an earlier stumble. His face was pale, eyes wide as they darted nervously among the shadows. "I told you it was dark. She was right there one moment and gone the next," he protested weakly. "Shut up, dumbass," Jake growled. Ronnie sighed. "Maybe we should cut our losses." Jake stopped abruptly, turning to face them both. "No, we need to find that little shit, and I don't care if you two die out here, but we're not leaving this forest empty-handed." Billy's anxiety spiked. "This place, it's not right. Feels like we're being watched." Seeing the anger in Jake's face, Billy instinctively takes a step back away from furious man. Jake opened his mouth to retort when suddenly a loud snap echoed through the night, followed by a gut-wrenching scream. Billy collapsed to the ground, clutching his leg. "Ah, help me!" he cried out, his voice strained with agony. Jake and Ronnie rushed to his side, the beam of the flashlight revealing the gruesome scene. A rusted bear trap had clamped onto Billy's leg, the jagged metal teeth biting deep into flesh and bone. Blood seeped through his fingers as he tried desperately to pry it open. "Hold still," Jake ordered, kneeling beside him. "Ronnie, help me get this damn thing off." Ronnie hesitated for a fraction of a second, his face contorted in a mixture of disgust and fear, before grabbing the opposite side of the trap. Together, they strained to pry the jaws apart. The mechanism was old but still viciously effective. Billy's screams filled the night air, echoing through the trees. "It hurts! Get it off! Get it off!" With a final effort, they managed to force the trap open just enough for Billy to yank his leg free. He rolls on the ground, panting heavily, tears streaming down his face. Blood poured from the deep wounds, soaking into the dirt beneath him. "Let me see," Ronnie said, attempting to inspect the injury. Billy whimpered, recoiling from his touch. "Don't! It hurts too much." Jake stood up, shining the flashlight around them nervously. The forest seemed to have grown darker, the shadows deeper and more impenetrable. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent, replaced by an eerie silence. "We need to keep moving," Jake said tersely. "We can't stay out in the open like this." Ronnie looked at him incredulously. "Are you serious? Billy's in no condition to walk. He needs medical attention." "And where do you suggest we get that?" "We're miles from anywhere," Jake retorted. "You're the one who insisted we chase the girl in here," Ronnie shot back, starting to loose it. Billy groaned, clutching his leg. "Guys, please." Jake ran a hand through his greasy hair, trying to think. The bear trap was a bad sign. It meant they weren't alone out here, and whoever set it might not take kindly to trespassers. Billy tried to stand, but faltered, his face contorted in pain. "Just pick his fat ass up and let's keep moving," Jake commanded, not sure of what to do anymore. Reluctantly, Ronnie moved to support him, draping Billy's arm over his shoulder. "I swear I should leave you here." As they began to move, the weight of Billy leaning on him slowed their pace considerably. Jake forged ahead, impatience evident in his stride. "Slow down, Jake," Ronnie called out. "We can't keep up." Jake turned, his expression hard. "We don't have time to dawdle. If there are traps out here, there might be other things we don't want to run into." Billy's eyes widened. "What do you mean, other things?" Jake, visibly nervous, said nothing but kept moving through the forest. They pressed on, the forest seeming to close in around them. The trees stood like silent giants, their branches intertwining overhead to blot out the sky. The air grew colder, and a mist began to rise from the ground, swirling around their feet. After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, the outline of a structure emerged from the darkness. The cabin stood in a small clearing, its silhouette warped and ominous against the backdrop of the night. "Hey, there is a cabin up ahead," Jake announced, relief evident in his tone. Ronnie eyed the building skeptically. "Doesn't look very inviting." "It's shelter," Jake replied curtly. "Better than staying out here." They approached the cabin cautiously. The windows were broken, and the door hung slightly off its hinges. The wood was darkened with age and neglect, vines creeping up the sides like skeletal fingers. Jake pushed the door open, the rusted hinges protesting with a loud creak. He shone the flashlight inside, revealing a single room with sparse furnishings, a table, a chair, and a cold fireplace that had no fire going. "Home sweet home," Ronnie muttered. They helped Billy inside, settling him onto the chair. He winced as his leg shifted, fresh blood seeping through the makeshift bandage Ronnie had wrapped around it. "We need to stop the bleeding," Ronnie said, grabbing hold of Billy's shirt and ripping a part of it off to use. Billy's breathing was shallow, his skin clammy. Am I gonna die?" he whispered. "Don't be dramatic," Jake snapped, though he avoided making eye contact. As Ronnie tended to Billy's wound, Jake wandered around the cabin, his flashlight illuminating the decaying interior. His gaze fell upon the fireplace, where ashes lay undisturbed. Above the mantel hung a faded photograph. Curious, he stepped closer. The picture depicted a family, a rugged man with an axe in hand, a beautiful blonde woman, and a little girl nestled between them. The man's eyes seemed to follow Jake, a stern expression etched into his features. A shiver ran down Jake's spine. There was something unsettling about the image, something that stirred a vague sense of fear. Jake frowned, turning away from the photograph. As he did, the side of his gaze catches movement outside the window, a flicker of shadow against shadow. He whipped the flashlight toward it, but there was nothing there. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself. "What's wrong?" Ronnie asked, noticing his unease. "Nothing," Jake replied quickly. "Just thought I saw something." Billy moaned softly, drawing their attention back. His face was ashen, beads of sweat forming on his brow. "He's losing too much blood," Ronnie said firmly. "If we don't get him to a hospital soon." Jake clenched his fists. "And how do you propose we do that?" "We're in the middle of nowhere." "Jake, please," Billy gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need a doctor. I'm not gonna make it." "Look at you, Billy," he sneered, whining like a little bitch. "I thought you wanted to be part of the big leagues." Billy's eyes flashed with a mix of fear and anger. "This isn't what I signed up for," he whizzed and coughed. "We were supposed to get the money and get out, not get lost in some cursed forest." Ronnie chuckled darkly. "Cursed forest? You're letting those old wives' tales get to you. Maybe the blood loss is making you loopy." "Shut up, Ronnie," Billy snapped weakly. "You weren't the one caught in a damn bear trap." "Enough!" Jake barked, his patience wearing thin. Billy shook his head, wincing at the movement. "Forget about the girl. We're lost and something isn't right about this place. We need to find a way back to the van." Jake's jaw tightened. "And leave empty-handed? Not a chance. You are so useless, I swear, Billy." Ronnie stands and sauntering over to Billy. "You are slowing us down and becoming a buzzkill fatso." "Fuck you," Billy replies meekly. Jake smiles. "My brother's got a point." "You're slowing us down. Maybe it'd be easier if we didn't have to babysit you." Billy's eyes widened. "What are you saying?" Jake took a few steps closer, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. "I'm saying that liabilities are a problem, and right now, you're a big one." Panic flashed across Billy's face. He tried to push himself up from the chair, but his injured leg gave way, and he collapsed back with a groan. "You can't be serious," he whispered. "We've known each other for years." "Business is business," Jake replied coolly. "Nothing personal." Ronnie smirked. "Hey, look on the bright side. At least you won't have to worry about a slow death anymore." "Please," Billy pleaded, desperation creeping into his voice. "Don't do this. I can still be useful. Just give me a chance." Jake drew the revolver from its holster, the metallic click echoing ominously in the confined space. "I'm making a decision for the good of the group," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Jake, wait," Billy begged, raising a trembling hand. "We can figure something out. Don't do this." Ronnie stepped back, watching the scene unfold with detached amusement. "Always knew you didn't have the stomach for this line of work, Billy." "Shut up, Ronnie," Billy spat, anger flaring amidst his fear. "You're just a fucking psycho." Ronnie's eyes narrowed. "Careful now. No need for insults." "Bye, Billy." Jake cocked the hammer of the revolver. Before Jake could pull the trigger, a distant sound reached their ears, a low, haunting wail that seemed to emanate from the very trees themselves. "What was that?" Ronnie whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Jake forced a laugh. "Just the wind." But Ronnie wasn't convinced. Didn't sound like the wind. The atmosphere in the cabin grew heavy, an oppressive weight settling over them. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the crackling of leaves outside and the laboured breathing of Billy. "Maybe Billy was right," Ronnie said quietly. "About this place." Jake didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the door, every muscle tense. "Superstitious nonsense," he finally muttered. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the gaps in the cabin's walls. The temperature seemed to drop, a chill seeping into their bones. Suddenly, a loud thud sounded against the side of the cabin, followed by a scraping noise. Both men jumped to their feet. "What the hell was that?" Ronnie hissed. Jake motioned for silence, straining to listen. The scraping continued, moving along the exterior wall toward the front door. "Maybe an animal," Jake whispered, though he didn't believe it himself. They exchanged a tense glance with Jake, already holding tightly to his pistol. The doorknob rattled slightly as if something were testing it. Jake raised the flashlight, pointing it at the door. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice firm. No answer came. The rattling stopped, and for a moment all was silent. Then, without warning, the door burst open with a violent force slamming against the interior wall. The flashlight flickered wildly as Jake stumbled back, momentarily blinded by the sudden movement. In the doorway stood a towering figure, silhouetted against the darkness outside. A white mask obscured the face, featureless except for the hollow eye slits that seemed to bore into their very souls. In one hand, the figure gripped a massive axe, the blade glinting faintly. Jake reacted first, raising his gun and firing a shot. The sound was deafening in the confined space, the muzzle flash illuminating the room for a split second. The figure didn't flinch. Ronnie's mind raced. This couldn't be real. It was a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear. Jake fired again, but the figure advanced steadily, each step deliberate and unhurried. "Run!" Jake shouted, grabbing Ronnie by the arm. But Ronnie stood frozen, his eyes wide with terror, as a small stream of fear ran down his left leg. The huge axe flew with astonishing speed. Ronnie's scream was cut short as the blade connected, sending him crashing to the floor. Jake didn't wait to see more. He bolted toward the back of the cabin, stumbling over debris in his haste. Behind him, he heard the sickening sound of the axe being pulled free. Desperation drove him to climb through a broken window, shards of glass tearing at his clothes and skin. He fell to the ground outside, the impact jarring but dulled by adrenaline. Scrambling to his feet, he sprinted into the forest, branches whipping at his face. He didn't dare look back. The only thought in his mind was escape. Back in the cabin, Billy's eyes darted around the room, searching for anything he could use as a weapon. His gaze fell upon Ronnie's knife on the floor and within reach. Summoning what little strength he had left, he snatched it up and brandished it defensively. "Stay back! I swear I'll use this." The slasher tilted his head slightly, as if contemplating the pathetic sight before him. Without warning, he reached out with his free hand. Billy swung the weapon, but the slasher caught his wrist effortlessly, his grip like a vice. Pain shot up Billy's arm as the slasher applied pressure, snapping his bones. The knife slipped from his fingers, clattering uselessly to the floor. "Please," Billy whimpered, tears welling in his eyes, "don't kill me." The slasher released his wrist, only to place his hand firmly on Billy's chest, slamming him against the wall. The force of the slasher's grip pinned Billy in place. Panic surged through Billy's veins. "Why are you doing this?" he cried out. "I haven't done anything to you." Moonlight cast dancing shadows across the slasher's mask, creating the illusion of movement where there was none. His silence was absolute, a void into which Billy's pleas vanished without a trace. With deliberate slowness, the slasher raised both hands and placed them on either side of Billy's head. He began to squeeze, the pressure on Billy's skull increasing steadily. Sharp pain blossomed behind Billy's eyes, escalating into unbearable agony. His screams devolved into guttural cries, then choked gasps as the relentless force continued. A final sickening crunch echoed through the room, and Billy's struggles ceased abruptly. The slasher let go, allowing the lifeless body to collapse onto the floor. For a moment he stood over the fallen man, his posture unreadable. Then he turned and walked outside. Meanwhile, Jake, a newfound believer in the slasher lore, was sprinting through the night, blind to where he was going or what had just occurred. He only knew he had to escape this nightmare. Rounding a massive tree, he was greeted by the glint of steel in the moonlight, the last sight he would ever see. In one swift motion, the slasher took Jake's head, leaving his headless body crumpled on the cold ground beside him. Jake's flight had come to a grisly end, his fate sealed by forces he neither understood nor could have hoped to escape. The Blackwood Slasher had pronounced his judgment. Moments later, the door to the cabin flew open. The slasher dragged Jake's headless corpse back inside, depositing it alongside Jake's severed head. Blood streaked the floor, pooling around Ronnie, Jake, and Billy, 3 dead kidnappers reduced to lifeless remnants. For a minute, the woods grew eerily silent, as though anticipating some grand event. Suddenly, the cabin began to pulse with a crimson glow that illuminated everything within. The bodies, the weapons, and the blood all vanished, slowly absorbed into the cabin's floor, as if the cabin itself were devouring them. When the light faded, no trace of the three men remained. All that lingered was the same old, dilapidated structure, quiet, unassuming, and undisturbed. And there, on a vacant rug near the now gentle fire, a little girl slept peacefully, blissfully unaware of all that had transpired, or of the unimaginable place from which she had just returned. Chapter 5. The masked figure stood in the hush of the night, his mission complete. He shifted his gaze to where Alice lay, unconscious but unscathed, her soft breathing steady in the moonlit clearing. He approached quietly, noting the slow rise and fall of her chest. With tender care, he slipped his arms beneath the child, lifting her as one would a cherished loved one. Gone was the menace he had shown to the kidnappers. In its place lingered a calm, protective presence. Moonbeams filtered through swaying branches overhead, painting dappled silver patterns across them both. Moving deeper into the forest, he walked in silence, the shadows parting at his approach and closing behind him, as though the woods themselves acknowledged his passage. Soon the babbling of the creek grew more distinct, the same barrier he was bound never to cross. Nonetheless, he pressed on, undaunted by that invisible chain. Around him, nocturnal creatures resumed their songs, and the wind whispered softly through the leaves. The forest, so recently the stage for violence, had reclaimed its natural stillness, cloaking all in the comforting veil of night. Eventually he came upon a small time-worn bridge. It had once allowed vehicles to cross. He even recalled seeing a red Jeep Cherokee, a man, a wife, and a small child passing this way, back before. But the memory slips away. Shaking off the reminiscence, he laid Alice down at the edge of the bridge. The creek that ran beneath it was enough to bar him from leaving this accursed woods. He stood for a moment longer, watching her sleep, until the sound of an approaching vehicle reached his ears from across the grass path on the far side of the creek. Satisfied she would be found, he turned and vanished back into the forest's depths. On the road, a black Cadillac rolled to a stop. The driver stepped out, opened the door, and stood aside as his employer emerged from the back seat. Though elderly, she moved with regal poise, her attire reflecting wealth and refined taste. Quietly she made her way through the tall grass toward the rickety old bridge, its wooden planks gradually succumbing to nature's reclamation. At her gesture, the driver remained behind. With careful steps, she crossed to where Alice lay, still lost to the world. Kneeling, the woman gently shook the young girl's shoulder. Alice stirred, blinking in confusion as she tried to recall where she was or how she had arrived there. Despite her uncertainty, something about the woman felt strangely trustworthy. The woman offered a kind smile. "I'm a friend of your parents," she said softly. "I've come to take you home." Though Alice couldn't remember ever seeing this woman before, the warmth in her voice and the comforting look in her eyes compelled her to trust. As the woman leaned down to take Alice's hand, Alice noticed a necklace dangling from the woman's neck, a silver locket with an unmistakable, intricate design. It seemed familiar, though she couldn't place why. Exhausted from the night's horrors, Alice wanted nothing more than to return home and find solace in her own bed. From a dark expanse of trees at the forest's edge, the Blackwood Slasher watched silently as the woman guided Alice toward the car. He did not move or make a sound, only observed until the two vanished from sight. At the cabin, a single framed picture rested on the mantel. It depicted a joyful family, a man gripping an axe, a radiant wife, and their beaming daughter. Around the little girl's neck was a silver locket, strikingly similar to the one the mysterious woman wore. The end.